If you're in the US and eligible to do so, vote, okay, for Joe Biden. Whatever you think of him, he is running on one of the most progressive platforms in modern history. And if you care about literally anyone other than yourself, you have an obligation to vote for him. As for the topic at hand, frankly, it doesn't matter what I think about this movie. And yet... A few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with my parents about their strictness during my childhood relative to my younger sisters. They were fairly permissive, and I am eternally grateful for that. But they held to relative versions of the MPAA's rating restriction rules. They didn't want me to watch PG-13 movies until I was 10-ish, meaning I had to see Austin Powers on VHS at my next-door neighbor's in order to be hip and with it during those deep, critical discussions of the latest cinematic treasures that we would have during elementary school recess. And I was to be 16 before seeing anything rated R. Except Billy Elliot. I could watch that. And I generally stuck to this, meaning that I never experienced the childhood traumas many of my friends did seeing their first slasher at age 8. I cannot count the number of folks who told me that they were definitely not old enough to have watched the original Halloween or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Exorcist. I've owned a copy of William Friedkin's 1973 classic since I was 15, when I bought a used DVD of the extended director's cut with the full intent of having it be the first R-rated movie I would watch on my birthday when such a thing was finally acceptable in my household. And then that birthday came, and I didn't. More than a decade passed, and I still didn't. Can you really blame me? I mean, sure, I am ostensibly a critic who talks a fair bit about horror, and so should probably have seen one of the most significant entries in the genre. But also the box that I threw away however many years ago said it was the scariest movie of all time, and it's over 130 minutes long, which just seemed like a lot. I'm certainly capable of watching longer horror movies, but it's never something I do on a whim, so I kept putting it off. But then quarantine happened, and I thought, you know what? Can't be scarier than Contagion. And not only was it not scarier than Contagion, it's not really scary at all. And I think that's interesting. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week Air Review. You can call me...
So let me ask you this. If somebody were to describe you to somebody you've never met, would they describe you as a Christian?
Not a Christian. And today, you get it, you know why we're here. William Friedkin took on William Peter Blatty's adaptation of William Peter Blatty's novel inspired by the actual church-authenticated exorcism, aka church-sanctioned abuse of a 14-year-old boy that took place in 1949 while still riding high off his acclaim for The French Connection, which had won him hella awards the previous year. And as a filmmaker who clearly wasn't interested in being pigeonholed by genre, before The French Connection, he directed a neo-noir, 2 musical comedies, and an LGBT drama that became a milestone in queer cinema. He went for horror. Not intentionally, he said, but perhaps inevitably. While I was unable to find it from a cursory check, I remember seeing someone tweet at Friedkin a while back about how they felt that The Exorcist wasn't horror at all, but like a supernatural thriller or something. Friedkin called him dumb, but it speaks to this very frustrating impulse that a certain subset of pseudo-intellectuals have when thinking about genre cinema. The last few years have turned the conversation away from all horror is bad to only elevated horror is good. And look, I love A24 brand horror. And if we give it a less pretentious name, I think it's worth having that as a subgenre the same way slashers and creature features and cabin in the woods flicks and exorcism movies are. But people who want to think of the works of Ari Aster and Jennifer Kent as being inherently more valuable are just jerks. The issue deep down is that horror is so intensely personal. I have said on multiple occasions and firmly believe that your reaction to a piece of art or entertainment says a lot more about you than it does the work itself, and this is why objective reviews are conceptually impossible and practically stupid. There is no objective measure because the person doing the measurement is subjective. And what does measuring art mean anyway? My 100-point review scale that I will not be applying to this particular subject may seem needlessly precise, but I'm not really scoring a movie or TV show or whatever. I'm scoring my reaction with all of the baggage that comes with it. And is there a genre more affected by that baggage than horror? Is there anything as personal as your fears? Fear is deep, primal, often speaking to your core belief system, especially when you get into supernatural horror, and especially religious supernatural horror. If you believe in the Christian God, then The Exorcist has a meaning for you that it never could for me, because even if you don't believe in exorcism as a concept, you believe in the underlying horrors that drive them. However, because demons and evil spirits don't exist, no one can be possessed by them. So, what's the scary thing? This movie's more overtly horrific scenes can't be anything more than a big fantasy fun time carnival ride. They could certainly be less. Now, if you have followed my work for a long time, you might be thinking, but Alec, didn't Paranormal Activity make you cry, you big baby? What the fuck's that about? Well, firstly, thank you. I appreciate the support, and it's a fair question. But the thing that scared me in Paranormal Activity was not the supernatural stuff per se, but the way it presented kind of like a home invasion movie where people were toying with an unsuspecting couple. Like, the girl standing over the bed for hours is infinitely scarier to me than some weird footprints appearing on the ground, even though you can't see the thing that's leaving them. The latter's bullshit, but I am, in my general life, afraid of being watched while I'm asleep. So, stripped of the supernatural context, that scene hits me right in my terror center. And what I didn't know about The Exorcist, but perhaps should have gleaned from the bits and pieces I had learned by virtue of existing over the past 20-something years, was that virtually all of the horror in the film comes from a demon doing demon-y things in a demon way. And the things that aren't are just a kid being kinda creepy. But let's be real, kids are small and weak, and I could definitely beat them in a fight, which I know from experience. And sure, this one has super strength, but I can do at least 13 push-ups, which is the spooky number, so I'm not scared. There are two versions of The Exorcist, the 1973 theatrical release and the 2000 extended director's cut, aka the version you've never seen before, which preceded the similar in-concept Apocalypse Now Redux by about a year. When I first saw the film a couple months ago, I watched that extended cut. When given the option, I tend to go with the director's cut over an original. In cases like these, where the director has come back to their work decades later and makes changes, I'm a little less dogmatic. But the version I'd never seen was the one that I had on DVD, so that's what I went with. And then last week, in preparation for this video, I watched the theatrical release. And while this is not going to be some big, deep dissection of the differences between them, suffice it to say, that will be my go-to in the future. I have to admit I was surprised when this film that I only knew from images of its bedroom set and that dope shot on the poster began at an archaeological site in northern Iraq. There, we are introduced to Max von Sydow, who is the only person in the film given the title The Exorcist, but is not actually the exorcist referred to in the film's title. While doing his archaeological thing, he finds himself face to face with a statue of Pazuzu, a Mesopotamian god who, we will soon learn, is hanging around in a random house in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. How and why did he make that trip? I'm glad they didn't try to justify it, because it would be real dumb. The fact that this god predates Christianity at least, and quite possibly Judaism, feels worth mentioning, but also why mention it at all? In any case, Pazuzu is in Georgetown, and specifically in the temporary home of actor Chris McNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, where he becomes intimately familiar with her daughter Reagan, played by Linda Blair in one of the most iconic child performances of all time. Second, maybe to Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone. We're also introduced to Jason Miller's father, Damian Karras, an ex-boxer from New York who became both pastor and psychiatrist, and he is having a crisis of faith. But he will need to work through that, since Karras will eventually be assisting von Sydow's The Exorcist to finally become the actual The Exorcist. And his story is really at the film's core. It's about finding faith. This story of demonic possession and the suffering of a little girl and the increasingly fragile mental state of her mother is all there so a man can figure out his own damage. He doesn't believe Chris at first because no one does, but over time he comes to understand the truth that the audience already knows. Something bad's going on. And only the power of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, hallowed be his name, can compel this ancient Mesopotamian god to stop bothering children. But first, we have to see him be that bother. Pazuzu first appears to Regan through a Ouija board under the guise of Captain Howdy because, sure, things escalate fast, especially in the theatrical cut, and this is basically the only place where the 2000 version genuinely improves upon the earlier release, because that one gives the confirmation that something is genuinely wrong with Regan a bit too fast for my taste. The longer edition brings back a scene where she's getting some tests at a doctor's office while beginning to show more subtle signs of the personality shift she undergoes as she begins to swear at the doctor in an out of character but not necessarily possessed sort of way. Even knowing what we all know about where the story goes, there's a little more mystery in it, which I liked. You get to wonder what's going on, if maybe it's just Regan being weird for a little bit longer, because once we see the dancing bed, there's no more wondering. But this mechanical bull riding mattress adventure was also the moment when I realized that maybe this movie isn't really all that scary, huh? I mean, sure, if I was lying on my bed and suddenly it started jolting around, I would be very upset. But also, as an image, it's not that intimidating, even with all of the screaming that's laid over it. Frankly, it's pretty silly. And so is a lot of this movie. When I reviewed Takashi Miike's Audition, what seems like centuries ago, I said that it had lost much of its shock since the 1999 release, but none of its value. And The Exorcist had another couple decades for audiences to become desensitized to what it's depicting. Head turning, vomiting, telling someone their mother's sucking cocks in hell. It's just pretty tame at this point, you know? I mean, I've seen scarier furniture being moved telepathically towards Ellen Burstyn, and when we're at that level of specificity, what's left, right? The most genuinely disturbing part of the whole movie is a scene where Regan gets a carotid angiography. Friedkin had doctors make sure the process was as realistic as possible, and the way that the blood sprays from the tube in her throat is genuinely unsettling in a way that the rest of the film just isn't. It's kind of like seeing the animals get actually killed in the middle of cannibal holocaust. The human violence looks fine, you know, but it could never have the viscerality of what they do to that turtle. And this has that sort of vibe. It feels truly real, and I did not enjoy that about it. Nor did I enjoy the spider walk, which was one of the big draws of the 2000 cut. Apparently it was deemed too scary for audiences, and the DVD proudly called out its return on the back of the box. Now, lacking context and seeing spider, I had absolutely no idea what that meant and thought it might be like a big spider, which was a little unnerving because I'm really not a fan of spiders, and maybe that had something to do with how long it took me to watch this movie. So I had kind of built it up in my mind, I guess. And then the big moment came literally out of nowhere, and 5 seconds later, it was over, and I just started laughing. I mean, look at it.
Oh my God.
What the fuck was that? And aside from how bizarrely short it is, it opens up a bunch of narrative issues, like the fact that no one ever acknowledges that it happened. And also, it is the only time Pazuzu Reagan leaves her room, which really makes you wonder why she doesn't do it again. Not to mention, it was digitally edited to look like this. The original scene was longer, a little floatier, and had Reagan make it all the way down the stairs and then attack people instead of just stopping and bleeding. It's less shocking because you don't have the blood, but because it's less shocking, it also feels less strange that it doesn't come up again and just generally feels more purposeful. And maybe some of this comes from what specifically scares me, right? Even if we put aside the lack of God's existence, I'm not scared by monsters I can see. And The Exorcist is all about the one right in front of you. Pazuzu deforms Reagan, distorts her face, and cuts her, says mean things through her mouth with its voice. But there's no hiding. I'm afraid of the things I can't see. There is nothing scarier to me than a dark window because I don't know what's behind it. When I lived on the first floor of a suburban home, I would put pillows up against the blinds to make sure that no one could look in because I read some creepy story about a girl who would see orange orbs each night in her backyard and one day investigated to find dozens of cigarette butts littered there. That is the stuff of my nightmares. The Exorcist is not. But it doesn't have to be. I may not have been afraid while watching The Exorcist. I may have even found it a little bit funny, but that doesn't mean I think that it is somehow ineffective. Sure, I wondered why an ancient Mesopotamian god would want to possess a little girl half a world away, or what Christ's power is going to do to compel it, but I was still concerned for Reagan. I wanted her to get better and to get it cast out. I wanted Chris to catch a break because she's having a real rough time in this movie. And I wanted Father Karras to make it through his crisis. I genuinely appreciated that he was so hesitant to jump at the idea of an exorcism, that he understood mental illness and wanted to make sure that medical options had been exhausted before shit gets spiritual. It creates this really fascinating tension in the audience, too. We know she's possessed, and on some level, want them to just get it over with. But the film's insistence on having her go through the procedures to rule out every other possibility is simply proper medical practice. If they went shaky bed straight to exorcism, they would be technically correct, and it would save a lot of frustration on everyone's part. But that would also make them terrible doctors. And Friedkin had to do this in order to make the world of The Exorcist feel plausible. People, on the whole, act in the way that you'd expect them to in real life. A little heightened, yeah, but fundamentally believable, which they must be, because by all accounts, the story it's based on is one he believed. As I mentioned, William Peter Blatty's book was inspired by an actual exorcism from 1949, one that he wanted to write about non-fictionally, but was unable to get enough information from to make it historically accurate. So he did what he could and fictionalized what he couldn't. And Friedkin went further, obtaining documents from the event and using all of that as the basis for his work. And even if I didn't come out of the other side of this a believer or feeling better about the existence of exorcisms, I did come out with a better understanding of horror. And that's more than enough for me. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamray and Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @BlasianFMA, Magnolia Denton, and Elliot Fowler. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I don't care. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you in the next one.